Namo tassa bhagavatu arahato sammasambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavatu arahato sammasambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavatu arahato sammasambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sangham namasami. So there's a question that I found for me always very relevant, is why am I here? What brings me here? What keeps me here? What draws us here in this particular place, in this particular group, at this particular time? Because I was just recently at a conference of a council of elders, Buddhist teachers in the east coast of America, near New York. And it's a very different scene there. Most of Buddhism is happening within the context of lay life, non-monastic life. And it has a particular flavor. There were the older generations, all mostly over 50s and 60s, if not in their 70s, 80s. We had a grandmama of Dharma, Ruth Denison. She was 89, still going strong. And you had the younger generations. A lot of students of a dear friend of ours, Noah Levine, whose parents used to do workshop with drawing several hundred people at a time on the subject of death and dying, grief and despair and so on. And the younger generation Noah Levine was a punk, he's a reformed punk, heavy doing type of punk, with tattoos from top of his head down to his last little toe. And of course his students, you can imagine, had a similar kind of symbol. They always all tattooed from top to bottom as well. Some of them really very interesting tattoos, mostly quite benign types of tattoos. I mean, Noah Levine has only got Dharma, Buddhist symbols tattoos. It's all Kuan Yin, Bodhisattva, you name it, female and male symbols, Buddhist symbols. Others had tattoo with pretty flowers all over their skull, with shaven head. So that was an aspect of the younger generations. We're trying to shake up the older generation, making us do things that would be completely offensive in England. In fact, there was one English elder teacher who really complained about the American way of being so kind of disclosing secrets of people. At some point we had two groups. One group, there was a hole, like here, and there was a line drawn across the hole, like tapes across the hole. And on one side you start with a whole group on one side, and then you have just difficult questions being asked, like, have you been unethical whilst teaching, for example? And so you have quite a large group of people going across the other side and looking at the side of people who are not unethical whilst teaching. Or, have you been abused as a woman? Have you been abused by male teachers? So you have a group of women going on the other side looking at the other group which hadn't for which it hadn't happened. And then there was an interesting one for the men. So there were several questions. Have you been asked to be violent towards women in your life? Have you felt pressurized to be violent towards women? Have you been forced? Have you felt, obligated to be violent, and particularly towards women? So you had a whole group of men walking on the other side, looking at the men and women on the other side. And it's kind of fun, it's quite... And then we had a few things like that. And I said, what is it that I love about the life I live, which is monastic life? Which has its own limitations, its own, quite a lot of limitations, quite a lot on a conventional level in our modern world, just in terms of the placing of women and the men in a kind of monastic traditional conventions, the skill in communications, how we communicate with each other. It's not always, that great in the traditional form of Buddhism. So here we are, having to be part of a convention which is quite, in a way, alien in the Western world for men and women. I don't think it's much more fun for men to see women in a kind of, junior position than it is not so much fun for the women to be in junior position. I don't think the trouble will just end in the women's community. Never thought that. And also in terms of communication, how we communicate, how we speak to each other, how we inform each other about in a real way, rather than a kind of imaginary way. So all these aspects were actually brought to the surface at the conference, because there is skills in this lay community of Buddhists, and there is an openness, and of course the conventions in their lay life is much more attuned to the Western values and Western cultural values, than our monastic culture, quote unquote, or monastic way of life. And so what is it that brings us here? What is it that draws us here? What is it that we dedicate our whole life to a lifestyle which is still a rather very unusual for Western educated men and women. Personally, for me, I was fortunate to meet Ajahn Sundara many years ago, and he mirrored to me the something that became very apparent in my life, is that the world I was living in wasn't as real as it appeared to be. The values of the world was not as appealing as they seemed to be. The truth of the world were rather shaky, and the fact that the society is continuously kind of encouraging greed, encouraging a lot of unskillful states of mind, a lot of unskillful behavior, wasn't particularly appealing. the lack of ethical values in society, the lack of restraint, the lack of awareness, the lack of consciousness seemed to me more and more sort of bring a perception of the world that was quite unappealing, unattractive. And so, through this lack of appeal of the world, then I began to search for something. I did not know what I was searching for. I had no idea. I was searching for something else. Did not know which way to turn, how to go about. And interesting enough, I discovered that this inquiring mind, this searching mind, drew to itself what it was needing, what it needed. It's like a force, searching is like a force in oneself that draws to itself what is needed somehow. Of course, we never know whether it's needed or just happened to be maybe just a chance, by chance. But personally at the time, it seemed to draw to me some responses which were not necessarily verbal responses or conceptual responses, but life situation, people in my life, insight into things. It was very attractive. This sort of suddenly things making some sense, not even on a rational level, but it was an energy of, I suppose, a kind of exploration, a sort of freedom, something that was showing me that the mind could be free to explore what this life is about. Exploring. It's a big aspect of my own practice. And then, little by little, I discovered I had a mind. That was kind of a bit shocking. In terms of realizing the world that I was living in was really, at least 95% of the time, a creation of my own mind. A bit of a shock, realizing the responsibility I had in my life, that this life was very much dependent on how I lived with myself, how I dealt with my own mind, how I related to it, and so on. And that brought me to Buddhism. Little by little, meeting Ajahn Sundara in the north of England, in a place where you never imagined that a great teacher like Luang Por would ever come. And there he was. And never really looked for a monk, I have to say. I never looked for tradition or religion particularly. But there was Ajahn Sundara had done hundreds of miles from London to come all the way to the north of England to give lectures at the university where I was staying at the time. And describing his way of life with Luang Por Chah. And I didn't even know what, in a way, this word dukkha, the word dukkha in Buddhism, particular context, suffering in a particular context. Where I was at the time, it was more insight that the suffering I was experiencing in my life, I began to see very clearly that it was just an appearance, the appearance of things. And the flip side of this dukkha was joy. And I couldn't put the two together quite. There was suffering on one side and joy on the other. And then when I actually get to know Buddhism, suddenly the word dukkha. The dukkha and the end of dukkha, that's it. This dukkha and the end of dukkha right there. And it was all in one, for me it was just more momentary things. Dukkha and the end of dukkha. So there was dukkha and the end of dukkha, which was this joy, this release from dukkha. It was joyful. Nothing to be frightened of, nothing to be scared, nothing to, apprehend, but just something to understand. And this is what attracts me most to Buddhism, is how it's all to do, it's all founded on this understanding of life, understanding of the mind, understanding of the complexities of the mind, understanding how our speech causes problems, or our speech causes happiness or unhappiness. Our actions by body, speech and mind can create heaven or hell depending on our intentions and our skills in communicating through speech, in restraint of actions, in restraint of our bodily actions, It had to do with understanding rather than having to imitate or become somebody. And that really appealed to me, because this understanding is always happening through consciousness, conscious awareness of now. That was another great appeal for me, because I had somehow come to understand deeply that in the here and now was the only place that was alive. There was no other places that was so alive as here and now. Everything else was just memories and thoughts. And I wasn't even a Buddhist at the time when I discovered that. But Buddhism seemed to give a framework to it which was so appealing to me. Suddenly I had a path. Rather than to be lost trying to figure out what to do with this insight or understanding, I suddenly had a structure to really move forward into this reality of now, this reality of the present moment. And I'm still there. I'm still committed to this reality of now. Now, when I hear other people talking about now, the power of now and nowness, here and the reality of now, it is something that can be very appealing, just even as a concept, as an idea. The simplification of the present moment is something very appealing somehow to what is in ourselves, to the part of ourselves which has already some understanding of Dhamma, whether we are Buddhist or not, some understanding of the way things are. And it's very much covered over, it's kind of buried under a lot of layers and layers of unfortunate conditionings and habits. I say unfortunate because it's, if they led us to this realization of the way it is, it wouldn't be so unfortunate, but it takes quite a long time to begin to understand how to let those things just fall away, and so you can begin to see what is here and now. And monastic life has an aspect that I think attracts people. It's actually not particularly this particular tradition is really making a stance on the world. I mean, the Buddha is really making a big stance. Most of our mind is of this world, just we're not saints. None of us are saints, or holy beings or otherworldly. But the monastic life and the training and the teaching that we are studying, whether it's a teaching we're studying our own heart, in our own mind, or the teaching that we are reading in the suttas, it's all about not attaching to worldly values, not identifying oneself with worldly values. And that is, certainly disconcerting to most of our conditioning. Because the desire to be praised, to do things well, so we get more praise, the desire to be loved. Who wants to be hated, the desire to be respected, the desire to be maybe not famous but appreciated, well known for whatever good qualities we have, making a name for oneself for whatever reason, And then we don't want to fail, that's the other one. We want to succeed. So these worldly values are very strong. It's called the worldly winds. I like the word. I don't know if it is really the translation of the Pali, but it's translated of worldly winds. It's that it blows through your mind. These forces of praise and blame, gain and loss, and pleasure and pain, and fame, defame, and so on, and success and failure. So, starting on this path, even after many years, in the here and now, in the moment, we discover what a human being is made of. This life is not concerned about reinventing the wheel of life, reinventing, saving the world, sorting out politics or economy or saving people in difficult situation or improving material conditions outside in the world. Also in Thailand, when you go to Thailand, you find that the abbots of many monasteries will receive a huge amount of money, donations, give those donations for hospitals, for improving qualities of life in society, giving money to schools, to hospitals, to all kinds of organizations that are dealing with society, and of offering very generously to organizations that improve the quality of life for people in the society. But our immediate kind of work in the monastery is not focused on that primarily, just now you could say just the natural outflow when you happen to be in the world of an abbot or an abbess, or then you have this opportunity to help the society in that way. I always had a sense that a monastic place, a monastery, and when I was much younger, I used to be very passionate about this. Not so passionate now, but it's the same truth. I find that a monastery is probably one of these most revolutionary stance in society. It's like, if you really want to create a difference in society, the monastery is an incredible social action as a kind of sangha, sort of practicing together. If you really want to make a difference in the world at a level which is perhaps more subtle for most people, we're not kind of carrying billions of pounds to the African parts of, to the part of Africa that are going through terrible situation. But we are doing a more maybe work that not so easily maybe appreciated in society, immediately appreciated, because it's more subtle. Many of even Buddhist monastery and many traditions are focusing a lot of attention on helping society, even in a Mahayana tradition, where you also have the example of great meditators, like in the Tibetan tradition you have Milarepa, in the Chinese tradition you have Shuyun, where you have these great meditators which are very close to the forest tradition in many ways, They are the great masters of meditation of those Mahayana tradition, yet the emphasis is very much about helping the society, helping people in a very active way. And the forest tradition doesn't appear to manifest in that way. It's much more focused on helping the mind to be liberated from delusion. So it is, it has, the emphasis is much more moving away from the worldly needs. And it's such a draw, it's such a kind of attraction to go out of oneself and to do things for others, because it is something very satisfactory. It's very, it's very hard not to do that, especially when ourselves we become kinder, more compassionate, We're more at peace with ourselves. We have more space for others to be with us. We have more patience, more qualities that really are needed in the world. It's so tempting to go out and help out. I still remember a time when Ajahn Sundara, it's one of the things I'm very, very grateful to Ajahn Sundara amongst many, many other things, but I realized that it's extraordinary to find one person in the world, I've never met any other people like him in that way, who was very much aware of the conditioning of women and the perception of women in society. I remember talking about this in the early years, where the women were supposed to be more or less the carer of society, the carer of people, the mothers, so to speak. And people would expect that from other women, People would expect that the women should help out. We should be, nurses or sort of doing things in hospital or education or relieving suffering somewhere, And Ajahn Sundara actually made a stance. No, we don't have to come from that conditioning to establish a women's community. And I remember even one monk, he actually wrote in an article in one of his books somewhere, 2 years ago, soon the nuns of Amaravati would be nurses in hospital. I have nothing wrong with being a nurse in hospital myself, but just to know that the work we do here is a particular type of work. It's it's a work of restraint, and it's very strange somehow. This work of just being more focused on the path of liberation from within, rather than going out and sorting the world out over there. For many of us, it is a strange path, If you still want to go out to sort the world, or if you're still dependent on external conditions to find peace or find stability or find happiness, it's very hard. So as you are in the present moment, what you discover is, you're glad you don't have to save the world, because you need a lot of energy just to stay here and now. I don't know if you've noticed. Just being present takes a lot of effort, strangely enough, at first. Huge amount of energy. I remember when I was at Chittas in the early years thinking that I had been a dancer and I could train for hours, I could move and dance and jump and all that kind of thing with no problem. And I remember having this insight that one moment of awareness took me as much energy as just dancing for an hour and a half. It was quite a shock for me to realize that, because I don't feel that now. But it was like, wow, just to be present, just to stay with the, my mom would be just kind of, going there and there, planning the cooking, planning the kitchen at Amarawa Chittas, planning my renunciation practice, how I was going to do this, how I was going to sleep less, how I was going to eat less, and then fighting with the conflict. No, I don't want to do this. Relax. And no, I've got to do this, and all the sort of the problem that comes when you become a meditator, and you're a perfectionist at the same time. You haven't quite made peace with your perfectionist mind, and the competitive mind, of course. You wanted to be as good as any of the monks there. If they're going to do sit-ins practice, not that it was not just competition. It's like inspired. It's like, oh, how great! This is wonderful. Let's do that. So it wasn't like I've got to do the same as a man. It's like, oh, that's really inspiring, Let's see whether we can do that. I can do that, So, not many people, have this really knowledge that being with oneself, living a restrained life, being conscious of one's action, body and speech and mind, that takes a huge amount of energy and restraint. The restraint that helps us to stay really connected with the here and now, present, pachupan, as we say in Pali. So you can begin to exploration. How do things arise in the mind? What conditioned them? What happened when they are present in yourself? What happened when you let them go? It's a real study. I mean, it's incredible. Reading the heart. Lumpur Cha talks about reading the heart. And we were just recently reading actually one of his teaching about training the heart, because we had a whole day about training in the nuns community recently. We just discussed what is training in monastic life. And I got, there was a beautiful teaching of Lumpur Cha, and when I was reading it, it says and do not read. Now we got libraries everywhere, we got books we can read all day, people are reading nowadays, they're studying the suttas, they're studying this, and Lumpur Cha, do not read. Absolutely do not read, So that was just, you could say that's teaching in a particular context. In the forest tradition, in his monastery, when he saw people being so caught up in their world, in their conceptual knowledge, then the response was, stop doing that. Let go. Just read your heart. And I have to say, reading the heart is quite a full-time job, how to read the heart properly. It's hard. Because the heart is so unruly. It's so undisciplined. It's so powerful and so rebellious. It's like having a tiger inside. Somebody just recently sent me a mail. She wanted to have a little chat before she comes on retreat here. And she says, I've discovered really that what Gandhi said was really true. When he said the biggest enemies, and it wasn't in the saying of Gandhi, but I think he was at the time dealing with the British in India, and he was saying the biggest enemies is really Gandhi, nobody else. My biggest enemy is Gandhi. Having to deal with this raging mind, sometimes the mind is really unmanageable. And yet it's trainable. Yet it's possible to train this unmanageable force in ourselves and to tame it and to realize that it's not as real as it appears to be as well. And that's the beauty of meditation. It just really gives you the most profound insight that what you think is solid isn't. What you think is real isn't. We live most of our life like a block of ice. That's one day I read in a teaching of one of the American Zen women teacher. She gave this beautiful simile of ego is like a block of ice, and I could never quite relate. I mean, I appreciated the image, but it never really, in a way, hit home for me. The image was real, so that was a really good image. But it didn't kind of spoke to me personally. But recently, it really did to me. It's like the ego, it's what we think of ourselves, it's like this block, fear, the fear, our desire. It's like it creates blockages everywhere in us, and it's very frightening because we don't like to feel that blockage. And what happens when we start looking at those blocks, suddenly they start getting a little bit of space within the experience of blockages. Mindfulness start creating some space, and around it, within it, you start getting, it's like what seems to be a solid rock begin to appear more like little gravels, with a little bit of space in between them. And then it's turned into more like sandy things, and finally, more like, something much less kind of tangible. And eventually you realize that what you thought was really solid and real is not solid and real. And that in itself is one of the reasons of the monastic life and the companionship in the monastic life, because really beginning to realize this intangibility of the sense of self that we think so solid is, I did appreciate when Lupo said many years ago that letting go of oneself is like going through a slow nervous breakdown. It's funny because at the time it really spoke to all of us. I think we could really appreciate the fact that losing one's identity, losing one's sense of self, losing who we think we are, is very kind of, it's kind of slightly jarring and a bit frightening at times, because we lose that knowledge of what we know and go into the unknown. It's not easy. We can go through all kind of mental states through this, all kind of feeling. We can feel depressed, we can feel angry, we can feel confused, we can feel that we become nothing, we can feel a sense of identification with a sense of nothingness, and then we become this nothing, we feel we're disappearing, or we become unimportant, nobody loves us very much because we are lost a sense of this kind of bright personality that we used to be, suddenly I'm nothing special. And if we identify with this, then it's really painful. I did. From before I came to the Sangha, I was going through a spiritual phase, quote unquote, and I was developing love, learning how to love people and so on. And then when I came to the monastery, then I suddenly became filled up with anger, with so many things irritating oneself, and so many people just not like your friends that you left behind, nothing that you really appreciated, particularly in the people you were around, who were around you. So suddenly you are in this kind of, the raging tiger just kind of becomes very alive. So I appreciate the monastic life because it does keep things simple. You don't have to save the world, you don't have to rearrange the world, you don't have to go earn a lot of money so you can go and help out in various countries. Or, it's not like, I don't feel that this is a selfish move not to be able to do that. I don't think the Buddha would have done that particularly. But for personally, the greatest gift that a human being can give to somebody else is this liberated mind. It's a mind that is on the path of liberation. The greatest gift that we can offer to society is a human being who understands himself or herself, has developed skillful, beautiful quality in one's heart through what? Not through saving the world, but through enduring and bearing with this raging, deluded tiger we have in ourselves. It's only deluded because we don't understand, we haven't looked at it carefully. Once you look at it carefully, you realize that the tiger is very tameable. It's not that bad. And then, little by little, one can gain confidence in this aspect of oneself, which is truly beautiful, and take refuge in that. The part of ourselves that has so much beauty and so inspiring in some ways. But the sense of self and delusion will insist on dragging your attention all the things that are wrong in oneself. If you find yourself negative about yourself, it's mostly a bad habit, which can be very satisfactory at some level. It's quite satisfactory about being grumpy and moaning about life. So it is a habit, and emotionally it's quite satisfactory for many people. If you stop moaning about things, you could feel very, very sort of out of sync with yourself. Like some people, I just was saying to somebody tonight, somebody I've known for many, many years, and who is quite negative and critical, and I said, well, I think it's about time you recognize all the wonderful things and all the generous things you've done in your life. fill up your mind with all these beautiful things, read them, put them on a piece of paper and read them. And you could see her negative critical demon was coming up. It's like, this is, it's so much resistance to this. It's like, no. And I know that myself. I've been through this many, many times. Somebody asked me to be kind when I was kind of righteously angry or upset about myself or others. It will be very, very annoying, I have to say. So this is a situation where we have a chance to really study the mind, and not the brain. Mind is not the brain. Mind is the life that comes out of ourselves. We can study it and let it go and realize that, at some level, once you do this, there's nothing else but helping oneself and others. It's like just natural outflow of a mind that is more at peace with itself. The outflow of a trained mind is kindness. Not because necessarily you feel kindness all the time, but we learn through the training to develop. You can learn through the training to develop a relationship to yourself which is based in acceptance, not of delusion, but acceptance of the way it is, of life in the here and now, acceptance of here and now. And that can be people, accepting people. One of the beauty, I could say, one of you could see the flowering of my life in the community of here is this sort of, what I've experienced recently, it's the sort of the beauty of making peace with life just as it is. This is something I've done for years, but the result of this is quite amazing. Is that block of ice is really, you can see how it's kind of turning into this beautiful water. The whole realm of the feeling between us, the water element, I consider is often associated for me with the emotional aspect of oneself, which is really, when you are emotional, you cry, when you're frightened, you want to go and you need to go to the loo, pee, when you sweat, there's a lot of, this aspect of emotions, so this ability to experience the thawing of the mind, and the softness of the mind. This is something, a real gift for this life for me. And this softness and thawing, it's not like the work is finished, or anything like that. The challenges comes all the time, but it's just nice to see that you can actually flow. Things do not stick so much, The sense of self is not kind of grabbing you and holding things in place the way it used to. It's just flowing. It's more flowing. Oh yeah, this is happening. Oh, I don't want that. Breathing out and it's go. And it's becoming almost like a second nature, more natural than it used to be. Before you felt you had to practice really hard, breathe in and out, Buddha, the whole lot, practice samadhi and get to, to the point of, reflect on things and do a lot of things. Suddenly it becomes more natural, like a second nature. And that is beauty of the training for me. That's something I appreciate in the training. Having this acceptance. And I can feel in this acceptance, there's also an acceptance of the conventional reality of monastic life, for example. Having a group of nuns, a group of monks, an abbot, what comes out of this is that, okay, we're all in it, all in it together, we don't have to fight, we don't have to worry about each other. But then how can we support each other, wherever we are? What can be, how can we be supportive? So it's not like going to war with each other. What is going to support my brother, my sisters, the abbot, my teacher, whoever that is. That's a beautiful feeling in the heart, If we go back to the nurturing, isn't it? It's the same nurturing quality, kind of going through a purification. It's not a personal thing anymore. It's just a normal, natural response to life, It's not nurturing because I feel it's a good thing to do, which is fine too, It's not nurturing with a desire to get something in return. It's not nurturing because you think the world is terrible and you have to save it, It's a normal response of being at peace with the way things are, So this is something that I appreciate, in this life. And maybe that will be for me what keeps me on the monastic path is this all the conditions present to do the work within in a very focused way. That's something that this life offers. And then out of that, then other people also can join in. If there was no monks and nuns here, you might not have a monastery. There's a monastery because there's a community of monks and nuns. And that, through our own practice, then we can also be encouraged, and encourage each other to follow a path which is not an easy one, which is not a easy one to walk on in the world. I always used to think that to be a monk or a nun, you have to have a little tinge of madness and lots of humor and a kind of sense of the cosmic jokes of the world, the big cosmic joke. Because you do end up very often into such a weird situation, Used to be, dance and be on stage and so on. And I thought, when I came, actually, that was my first realization. When I came to the Sangha, the first month, I think, I thought, wow, I've left the performing art, but I think I've gone onto the grandest stage of this planet, on this planet here. There was a Chetas in the early days, when everything looked really spooky. Well, all the monks just came out, they seemed to be coming out of the forest, kind of a bit rough to me. I was used to a more refined world, I like beautiful dress and beautiful makeup and beautiful hair and all the rest of it. I used to have supper with candles and good wine and baroque music in the background, and then I ended up at Chitas in this kind of spooky workshops, with lots of, 5 guys that looks like with brown robes around them, like, what's that, 3 women that had nothing to do with, kind of thing. And living in the countryside, I was more a city girl, The idea of walking down the mud or holding on brushes with paints and all that was absolutely unthinkable at first for me. Didn't like cooking either, and I had to cook for 5 years for many people, which I began to enjoy because, of course, I'm also addict to pleasure myself. I used to be more addict to pleasure, so I made it pleasurable. And I actually began to really enjoy cooking as well. There were so few things you could enjoy in the monastic life. There was I began to enjoy cooking. I think some people can even remember I could be quite a good cook. I was so greedy in those days. I could share the greedy moment of everybody in the community. I knew exactly what they would love. I make huge pot of gruel with peanut butter and smashed bananas in them. And I knew everybody would love it, just like me. So, or this moment when you have practiced mindfulness and do all your non-renunciation practice and feel really kind of, you're doing very, very well, you end up in the kitchen and the next thing you know, you're out of the kitchen, just about to kill somebody. And I still remember the time when I walked off the kitchen, and I didn't like to walk alone in the countryside on my own. I was a little bit frightened to be just on my own. I was not used to kind of walk alone in the countryside, And I still remember the day when I walked past Ajahn Amaru with my boots. at Chithurst, I was absolutely on like 200 miles an hour, like walking, nothing was going to stop me. I was really walking very, very fast with big pair of boots, absolutely raging, was so angry with everything. Enough heat to do about 20 kilometers running, I think. And then Ajahn Amaro just appeared in front. I said, oh gosh, I've got to slow down. I can't go past a monk, I have to walk behind a monk. And I remember my mind going this terrible conflict, forms, forms, my anger, form, anger. I was a terrible conflict. And finally I just gave up. I said, no, I'm just going to walk past Ajahn Amaro and that's it. And I continued for another several kilometers and came back before the meal to eat something. So this is a kind of funny thing that I would never have had in lay life. I would be more having a cup of coffee and doing my dancing and sort of, not big boots and walking several miles raging on things. So, Yeah, just to talk about them actually brings a sense of, in a way, appreciation of my life, just a sense of love for what he brings up and the insight one receives through these many situations, and also the the natural humility that just comes. It's not like one is a humble person particularly. But by seeing the conceit of your own mind for so many times, this conceited mind, you have no doubt that you have to be very careful. Humility just comes from being at peace with your own conceit. Not trying to be too humble. I mean, trying to become humble is good. For some people it works. For me it's never worked, Becoming something has never quite made it for me. But certainly seeing my own immodest, conceited, not humble nature of my mind, that's kind of been really a very much the way out of this attachment to conceit, to my own conceit, and kind of little by little letting, sort of chopping off these habits, little by little, and it continues till, I would say, till the last breath, So it's not the end. So this is something, when I was at the conference, I noticed that people often talk about making things better all the time, adapting and improving, and we had to think about how to improve Buddhism over the next 30 years. It's interesting. And so this kind of culture infiltrating into the Buddhist teaching. How can we make Buddhism in such a way that it fits perfectly into the world? Well, firstly, it's not the kind of Buddhism that interests me. Even though it's a natural outflow, it's a natural outcome, you could say, of people benefiting from the Buddhist teaching, living in society and contributing to their society, contributing to the environment. But the actual work is a continuous kind of letting go of this ignorance of the mind, attachment to deluded states, attachment to unskillful, unhappy, miserable, blind mind states. And in Buddhism, that aspect is called nibbida, disenchantment with the world, with worldly values, disenchanted with worldly values, nibbida. I like this word, like contentment, santuti, nibbida, contentment. Brings a sense of peace to the heart. And it's not a peace that is just quiet. It's a peace of awakening, being awake. That's a peace of being awake. It's not a peace of tranquility and identification with tranquility. That's not that kind of peace. It's a piece of being actually start looking at the Dhamma, looking at things as they are. We all know how many times we just kind of run off. It takes very little, very often, just to kind of be miles away from that place of here and now, seeing. And yet this is a work that we are involved with. So, I'll leave you on this.